So we can talk about various theoretical reasons for why there might be a difference in the number of Islamist extremists between, for example, Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. And so here are some variables that people have tended to look at within the literature as they're trying to explore this. But again, keep in mind that this is such a difficult thing to explore. But one is the degree of authoritarian rule. And this is a very popular variable. Everywhere from the media and government figures to all around academia, people have been saying for years that crackdowns on political freedom bring about militant Islam. The idea here is that if people have a lack of institutionalized means to express themselves, they're not co-opted or able to work within the system, and so they advocate for much more radical change. But if this is based on authoritarianism, then why isn't this incremental? Shouldn't we have the most extremism going on in Turkmenistan, and then Uzbekistan, and then Tajikistan, and then Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan? Why do we hear so little about this in the most authoritarian regime of all? In fact, in Turkmenistan, mosques are quite empty. They're actually there. The leader has fused ideology, the Rukunama that I mentioned before, with religion, so that imams, religious leaders, are incorporating the state ideology into their religious teachings. Another argument, cultural susceptibility, is focused on these long ago traditions, the oasis versus the nomad, the sedentary versus nomad people. And some of these have been played up. President Akayev, for example, stressed that the Kyrgyz were liberal Muslims whose nomadic past ensured that they would always keep a, quote, healthy distance from religious extremism. Indeed, the evidence of extremist activity is mostly tied to the Fergana Valley and other ethnic Uzbeks, but there's talk of ethnic Kyrgyz who also embraced a harder line on Islam since the mid-2000s also. So the evidence, whatever evidence we have, is a little bit mixed there, but it's another theoretical way of looking at it. It's just hard to find evidence for any of these. There are also economic aspects, which are not necessarily tied to politics. We're doing better should bring about less radical Islam, right? Because if we're talking about a society that's doing okay, then people don't look for radical alternatives like nationalism and radical Islam. Yet, talk of Islamists was especially tied to Uzbekistan in the first decade after independence, the place where the economy was doing best of all of Central Asia, or at least badly, rather than in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan where it was doing the worst. We should have, for example, found the highest level of radical Islam in parts of Kyrgyzstan that were in the Fergana Valley, and we didn't necessarily find that. There's also been the argument that if you're officially more open to foreigners, as in visa and immigration policies, then you're going to have more Islamists coming to town and preaching radical Islam. But this would seem to make Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan very good candidates, and Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan awful ones. Now, Turkmenistan, fine. We don't have much radical Islam, so that makes sense. But in Uzbekistan, they talk about lots of radical Islam. Okay, I mean, this is the place where there are police all over the country. I was repeatedly searched when I was in Uzbekistan. I don't know if I look like someone preaching radicalism, but I don't have a beard. There was also the argument that proximity to Islamist strongholds might determine the strength of a radical Islamic movement. And here we're talking about illegal immigration, radio and TV, all those sorts of communications that can bring neighbors into this. But Tajikistan, sure, Tajikistan happened, and it was closest, one of the closest to Afghanistan. But same with Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan has a long border with Afghanistan, or a border with Afghanistan. So, or I should say, Turkmenistan has a long border. With Iran. And so, if we're talking about a radical Islamic regime, well, Turkmenistan should be susceptible to this. And another final argument here is information flow. Ideas going through the internet, people conveying via the Hajj, when people go out to these pilgrimages at Mecca, etc. This is sort of the inverse of the authoritarian hypothesis. But there's also little evidence that, for instance, you've got more religious extremism in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan than in Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, where information flow is much more restricted. Of course, again, it's hard to measure foreign influence via the internet. You've got Uzbek travelers on the Hajj, you've got subsequent emails to one person in Uzbekistan with a strong group of backers who serves as a conduit. All these things could happen. We just don't know. So very hard to measure all these things. So now this brings us to some of the problems with scholarship in Central Asia Islamism. It's really hard to back up claims like, quote, the opposition groups are increasingly turning to the ideas of militant Islam. Increasingly. What does that mean? Over time, there's lots of data to back this up. There is no data. One author, for example, points to numbers of arrests and convictions of radical Islam as evidence of a rise in radical Islam. But remember, the more arrests you have, it could be a function of regime type. It could be people being framed. It could be through mistakes representing a lack of information on the part of authorities. It could be failures on the capacity. It could be you could have more arrests in one state and less in another because of the capacity of the state. For example, if Tajikistan is still a shaky state, we would have fewer arrests than in other states that are stronger. It doesn't mean radical Islam's less powerful there, though. It could be about the rule of law. If Kyrgyzstan is more liberal, then they probably demand more evidence before making arrests than illiberal Uzbekistan. It doesn't mean there's less radical Islam in Kyrgyzstan. It's just a different arrest criteria. So this is an experiment that, again, hasn't. It's empirically very difficult to rely on something like this or to accept this. Another statement: a growing number of Uzbek oppositionists have turned to militant Islamist movements. Oftentimes, there are no citations, no figures. It's based on quote-unquote common perceptions, which again is very problematic. People are grabbing at straws when events occur. One author talks about Andijan in 2005, which I'll get into a little bit later, as if this is customary. But this was the first time that you've got massive force used against demonstrators, probably also the largest demonstration in Uzbekistan. And there were lots of demonstrations that were economic that were stopped far short of violence. And they were often led by women, making violence more difficult. So none of this, Andijan doesn't seem to be the sign of something bigger, something more customary. In short, it's difficult to see that there's an increased threat of radical Islam in Central Asia. People have been saying that there is for years. If you say it's going to rain for long enough, then one day it'll probably rain. There is scholarship that highlights why we might expect and not expect to find radical Islam gaining ground. And I just highlighted the theoretical variables above. We just need better measures to tell if it actually is. In the meantime, we can use what we know to analyze these events and begin to piece them together over time to highlight the greater or lesser likelihood of radical Islam becoming a force. But it's very difficult to actually use these right now to demonstrate empirical evidence that it is a force, or that it's become more of a force.